results in the past. For example, when George Bush or Trump's 2016 win.
Yet suddenly, 20, putting their own eyes that our election system has been thrown into complete chaos. That is the only election in which proper to question whether the results.
The poll was conducted in the week of December, getting samples from over 1,000 respondents, mostly equal parts Republican, Democrats, and third-party voters. Ariane Pastar, NTD News.
Sarah, to put investing in American companies and American manufacturing first. We recently sat down with her to discuss. Congresswoman Diana Harshbarger, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure always, Steve. You know you can call me, I'll come.
You and the Florida Senator Rick Scott, you sent a letter to Secretary Becerra urging him to prioritize American manufacturing over China. It seems like common sense. Why did you do it, and what has been the response?
We sent $1 billion in 2022 to companies with Chinese ties to make COVID tests. I'm like, does that make a lick of sense? And when they issued N95 masks to the members of Congress and we had to wear them on the floor, right on the side it said made in China. And I thought, well, this is not good. And so this year they want to send another $500 million over to companies, to China. We are sending tons of money to an adversarial nation, and all that we get in return is that they sent COVID to us. And so Senator Scott and I wrote a letter to HHS Secretary Becerra to say, look, we don't want the Biden administration sending any more money to China for COVID tests or anything else for that matter. We need to prioritize American manufacturing. And I've said this since I've been here. If we can do it here in America, we need to do it. If we can't, we need to contract with allied countries who have our best interests at heart.
How problematic is it that, given the fact that COVID-19, we also refer to it sometimes as the CCP virus, the Chinese Communist Party virus, originated in China, that U.S. contracts could essentially allow China to profit? Are you seeing that with the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, which is bipartisan now, that some of your colleagues on the left and Democrats are getting on board with your type of legislation?
Some of them are, absolutely. And they do agree that advanced manufacturing in America is an answer. We have the only plant in the country that produces penicillin, and it's in my district. That's a model. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can incentivize these companies to manufacture right here in our own country, and we need to do that. That's critical. If you look at just stockpiles, that goes back to the Department of Defense. We need to stockpile certain drugs. And right now, what's China dealing with? They're dealing with these pneumonia cases in pediatrics. So how do we know that's not coming in some way, shape, or form? And good Lord, I look at the cases of RSV that are increasing right now, not just in children, but the elderly. And then I look at the wide open border and how many Chinese nationals has come over, and I'm thinking they're bringing disease states that we've eradicated or go up dramatically here in this country.
You just returned from the border. Last week, I believe we hit a record. Over 12,000 people passing through the border in a single day illegally. What did you experience? What were you seeing down there?
They told me how many countries people are arriving to this country from. It's almost every country in the world. And so they change. The cartel, it's a business to these people. So instead of coming through the Rio Grande Valley sector now, they'll go to the El Paso sector, and then the Tucson sector is being inundated with illegals because they change it up. They know where our Border Patrol agents are. And, this morning I heard at Del Rio that, it was one officer to 400 people, and then you go to some of the other sectors, and it is even more than that. This is unsustainable. If 1,000 a day is untenable, what do they think that 12,000 a day is? They are just releasing them into the country without a return to court date. And we don't know who's here. And that's just the people that they process, Steve. That's not the gotaways that we don't know. And the drugs coming over, I saw a chart on which sector and what drugs were prominent in each sector. And it's unbelievable. Even at where I was, the illegals may not be coming through as often as they were. but it's the drug trade. And their number one drug at the RGB sector is marijuana. And he told me it's not the marijuana of the 60s. These are very potent strains, and a lot of it contains fentanyl. It's laced with fentanyl.
Congresswoman Diana Harshbarger, thank you so much for sitting down with me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, less than 3 weeks before a critical section of FISA sunsets on December 31st. But lawmakers are pushing to pass the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, the annual defense bill, this week, which could or would extend the spy program through April 19th of next year. Joining us now to assess is Micah Meadowcroft, Research Director at the Center for Renewing America. Micah Meadowcroft, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. It's good to be here.
Of course. So, Micah, both the Intelligence Committee's bill and the Judiciary bill regarding FISA Section 702 face criticism from both parties. Why do you think that is?
FISA 702 was introduced to enable warrantless surveillance of foreign intelligence assets. However, as time and time again has shown, it has also been used to abuse Americans' Fourth Amendment Bill of Rights liberties, as in hoovering up electronic communications data for foreign nationals, it also hoovers up Americans' communications without a warrant. And you are entitled as an American citizen to only have, you're entitled to freedom from unauthorized and unreasonable search and seizure. And so, of course, we have not so far gone that people don't understand the road to tyranny that indicates.
Now, given the heightened national security concerns, such as the open border, threats from Iran and others, what are some of the next steps, do you think, for lawmakers regarding FISA reauthorization and reform?
So FISA 702 is set to sunset at the end of the year, and we believe that it is absolutely necessary to just hold the line and let that sunset, let that expire, because the intelligence community has not shown itself responsible with the use of these powers. This would be like, let's say you went hunting with your son. It's his first year, you've given him a great gun, and he uses it dangerously and almost hits one of your, a family member, someone that you were hunting with. You don't just, let him say he's sorry. You need to make some consequences before you give him such a dangerous tool again. And it's time for the intelligence community to face those consequences. It's really remarkable. If you listen to what they're saying, they aren't saying that there haven't been abuses. They're admitting there have been abuses. They're claiming it's worth it. And I'm reminded of the Ben Franklin quote that those who would give up some essential liberty for the sake of a little bit of security will in the end both deserve and receive neither liberty nor security.
It's a great point right there. Speaker, his conference for changing direction on FISA reform legislation a few times. Do you think this helps or hurts ahead of other votes in this week, particularly on the NDAA and the impeachment inquiry?
Well, from what I've heard, it looks like there may be efforts to slip 702 reauthorization, a so-called clean reauthorization, temporary, supposedly, into the NDAA, and that means it's a non-starter. Now, the NDAA bill, this particular one, is a non-starter regardless. It gives up everything to Chuck Schumer and the rest of the Hill cartel. But if it includes 702 reauthorization, this so-called clean reauthorization, which is to say with no defenses against the further violation of American rights, then it needs to be absolutely voted against.
Micah Meadowcroft, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Regulators in Washington want to make it easier for you to switch TV providers. The Federal Communications Commission is proposing new restrictions on fees being imposed on subscribers who want to change services. The proposal would allow partial refunds for subscribers who cancel in the middle of the month. This is part of President Biden's executive order from 2021 that directs the federal government to find ways to boost competition. Biden has also been outspoken about eliminating so-called junk fees. Republicans on the FCC's commission voted against the proposal, but they were defeated by the Democrats in a 3-2 vote. The FCC will now open it up to public feedback before taking a final vote. And that is all we have for you this evening on the Capitol Report. Thank you for watching. From Washington, D.C., I'm Steve Lance. Have a nice evening. See you back here tomorrow.
Which anti-disinformation was being used as a cudgel for censorship. So the declaration essentially addresses in particular that, not only that, but that's the kind of the main thrust of the declaration. Essentially says so much of this work is illegitimate and should be pushed back, and we need free speech and free expression if we're going to maintain a free society.
Does the word malinformation ever appear in the Westminster Declaration? I can't remember right now.
It may, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
But malinformation is one of these words that I find to be so particularly pernicious, right? Because it's, if I remember correctly, the definition, but basically it's something that's true but against the narrative.
It's information that is used in ways that someone else doesn't like.
So, and that's actually something that's prohibited in some places.
Yes. So that, I mean,
Like officially.
yes, in terms of the stretch of the definition. At the same time, dis and misinformation have been so corrupted as terms that essentially they have the same function. We had with the Virality Project this so-called anti-vaccine disinformation initiative run out of the Stanford Internet Observatory claimed that true stories of vaccine side effects should be considered misinformation. This was the advice they were giving to their 7 big tech partners. So even the other words are being corrupted. The whole kind of conceptual framework essentially is moot in many respects.
You've been interested in the topic of actual disinformation for quite some time, as have I, and you've recognized, I guess, the ill effects of that. My eye was particularly on communist China, you other places. So why don't we just start by you telling us a bit about how you came to be so focused on issues of free speech?
Sure. So in 2005, I founded an NGO, a nonprofit that worked predominantly in Southeast Asia, but also in East Asia and South Asia on issues of online free expression and also online privacy and other sort of digital civil liberties issues, we might say. That was because I'm from Australia. We were very kind of focused on building bridges between Australia and Asia and kind of focusing on what was important around, I guess, the new forms of human rights online that were emerging in the early 2000s as the internet rose in use. And so we were working in Indonesia. I lived in Indonesia for 5 years. I lived in Thailand for almost 4 years. I ran that NGO for almost 18 years. And we were dealing in countries with serious levels of repression of free speech. Oftentimes dictatorships like Myanmar or Thailand, other places around the region. So everyone that we were working with, who predominantly would have identified as liberals and progressives, were interested in human rights, democracy, and free speech. There was not really ever a question around that. At some point, the question of disinformation began to pop up, and it was real in the sense that there really were state actors, say, in the Philippines who were building online troll armies to distribute mis and disinformation online, try and manipulate elections, decision-making, public opinion, etc. So that was real and is still real and needs addressing. And there were pernicious Singapore where they would use fake news as a way, as mis and disinformation are used now, to squash dissent. And the progressive activists that we were working with in the NGOs, they knew that. And so they were campaigning against these kind of fake news laws. So when I saw then people in the West start getting into these new forms of kind of pro-content moderation, they might call it, it was like for someone in the Philippines or someone in Thailand to start going, you need to trust the government more to manage content on the internet. No one was thinking that was a good idea. And so there was this schism that started developing. At the same time, because that NGO space is predominantly populated with people from the kind of middle and upper middle class, they took on far too much of the ideas that the West was imparting to them, also because the money was coming from the West. It was coming from the big foundations that they were reliant on. So
your nonprofit, from the outside, almost appears to be like many of these other nonprofits that exist right now that actually kind of, in the name of, making sure that good, accurate information is transmitted, are actually playing this kind of censorship role.
So there's actually two things. So one, that organization was called Engage Media, that I've now left, and then started this new entity called LiberNet. And the previous organization that still existed, Engage Media, there were anti-disinformation initiatives that we participated in that I think now still stand up. There were, say for example, addressing troll armies in the Philippines that were clearly kind of state-based manipulation of public.
Well, I keep thinking of the 50 Cent Army, the infamous 50 Cent Army.
Yeah, so these things are real, but they totally overreached, and they overreached partly because the culture changed and people became kind of more pro-censorship, and because the philanthropy changed and started directing people more in this direction.
So you actually saw organizations that at one point had been genuinely, kind of trying to foster free speech and expression become kind of their own worst enemy, I guess.
I don't think they would definitely not see it as that. I mean, it depends who I'm holding in my mind and thinking of as an example. If I'm thinking of the local groups that I would have worked with, say, in Indonesia, I think they would have thought that, no, they were combating this kind of state or kind of corporate, top end of town kind of disinformation. So I think it's been much more in the West where the shift has occurred conceptually, where the kind of policing of disinformation or the kind of transparency and advocacy around it switched from targeting the most powerful actors to essentially targeting everyday people. And I think that's linked to this idea around essentially the kind of massive amount of infrastructure that was built up during the war on terror that then became kind of countering violent extremism, which then became a kind of countering populism, or got hijacked to counter populism, and essentially got directed towards everyday people. That's why I say, for example, in Australia, for the Twitter files that I did there, the Department of Home Affairs, which is essentially where the kind of counter-terrorism unit is housed, are dealing with an account with only 20 followers. Like, what is that doing? Why does it need to be doing that? It's completely off mission, at least based on the kind of outline that it gives to the general public. But internally, there was a massive cultural shift where this became acceptable, that was driven in many respects by progressives. But it was started by neocons. This is the new weird world that we live in, that essentially this kind of neocon, war on terror, massive amount of surveillance infrastructure that was built up is then kind of turned into this countering populism infrastructure that the left, which previously were the people who were most suspicious of the war on terror and the various agencies that became extremely bloated under that banner, have now signed up to be part of it.
We'll be right back after a short break.
They gave out was used, and that it was very, very targeted towards their specific objectives. And so I think part of the panic was to see, well, when we said free speech, we didn't mean that. We meant we meant this. And I think there was a lot of a big ideology around the internet at the beginning that was extremely utopian, that essentially imagined that what the internet looked like at scale was more people like people from Harvard, and people from Yale, and people from the West Coast, and then actually that isn't most people at all. And then the plebs essentially got on the internet, and they all freaked out and went, "Oh my God, we can't have this. This is not what we meant. We assumed there would be this civilizing process." I don't know why they thought that would come along with this process of getting access to information, et cetera, et cetera. And then you see this switch from, well, the internet's a bit out of control. There's an infodemic. You know, it's dangerous, and there are problems. Like, absolutely true, but a certain amount of people were motivated, I think, for good reasons, and a certain amount of people were going, we're losing political control here. This is very, very dangerous. We need to do something. And it's all mixed up. So when you look at, say, that diagram of the censorship industrial complex, it's not that every single organization in there or every single fact checker or university institute is, you know, working for the man. It's that there's a mix. There's a total mix. And that's why, in some ways, it works, is because there are people who are kind of in there doing very directly work that very directly contradicts the actual aims of what anti-disinformation should be. So, for example, the Virality Project, which calls true stories misinformation. And then there are legitimate groups that might be a local organization in the Philippines who are combating these troll armies that are created by political parties or the government. But it's all kind of going into one blob, and then so teasing it out is quite difficult to do. Who's a legitimate actor? Who's illegitimate? An illegitimate actor. Sometimes they might be swapping back and forth on the same day and have some staff that are doing quite legitimate work and other staff who are doing very, very politicized work.
Yeah, for example, very familiar with the German Marshall Fund, which still exists, right, in the U.S. And you know, they had a program doing this kind of stuff. They also have a whole bunch of programs which I thought were very useful, actually.
There needs to be a legitimate basis for what these organizations are doing. They can't call themselves the Global Censorship Project. They need to be, you know, tasked with a mission that ordinary people, you know, well-intentioned people can get on board with. So, for example, if your mission is to, you know, stop the next Christchurch massacre, that is a well-intentioned and good idea.
Everyone would be on board with that.
Who would not want to do that? But the problem is that it gets kind of chipped away, and then at some point starts accelerating dramatically. I would say it was around COVID. Some people might say it was Russiagate or before, but certainly around COVID, there was a uptick would be an absolute understatement. And there's this whole sector, the sector that I was part of, which is dedicated to online free expression, which gets hundreds of millions of dollars, you know, across hundreds or thousands of different NGOs. These are not just organizations, you know, looking at anti-disinformation. They're organizations that are, you know, tasked with protecting free expression online. That is their remit. I can count on one hand the number of organizations from that sector who put their hands up during COVID and said, you know, this is, you know, censoring the idea that there might be been a lab leak, or how effective is masking, do the vaccines stop transmission. Almost none of them touched any of it. We did at Engage Media, we did something modest because it was very difficult to even get my staff on board with what was going on. I think that would probably have changed now, but this is this collapse. When we talk about this collapse of institutions, there was this massive sector, it's still there, who are meant to be looking out for free expression online, who failed.
Than fail. I would not, or I actually
Right.
worse
It is
than
wor-
fail.
It is worse than failed.
Yeah.
Some of them became part of the apparatus of censorship, lots of them. And so my connection there was that I could see during COVID that something wasn't quite right. I've been doing work around media, kind of censorship, propaganda for more than 25 years. I probably read Manufacturing Consent when I was 19. And something was just a bit weird. This is not Iraq WMD type public opinion management. This was something new, and it was something online, and there was different things going on, and it was much more difficult to understand. And so I had this sense that something wasn't quite right. So I also knew when to look. So when I came on board to work with Matt Taibbi on the Twitter files, the reason that he brought me on was essentially I knew a lot of the people. Some of them I knew personally that were leaders in this so-called anti-disinformation field, and so I knew who was connected to who, and all the different funders, and where the meetings happened. But at the same time, my mind was blown because I didn't think that they were to find them so ascendant into the center of this new system of public opinion management was also mind-blowing. To see the connections, particularly, say, with the intelligence community as well, or to see, for example, a so-called anti-misinformation organization like First Draft, who actually co-coined the misdis and malinformation framework, participating in the Aspen Institute's Hunter Biden laptop tabletop exercise 2 months before anyone, apart from the Trump campaign team and the FBI, knew about the laptop. They somehow, the Aspen Institute, managed to put together this exercise with the New York Times, with Rolling Stone, with CNN, with Washington Post, with Twitter, with Facebook.
We weren't invited for some
You
reason.
were not invited. I saw the email and you were not on there, Jan. Next up.
This particular instance or this particular example is, I think, telling because extremely early on, it was incredibly obvious that this was real, right? And somehow for years, there was actual incredible amounts of disinformation fed into the system repeatedly. And now kind of, I think, does everybody understand it's real? I think.
Well, yes and no. So, for example, a couple of months ago, I went to the 25th anniversary event of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. We were talking about it earlier at Harvard. I was there for a fellow for a couple of years. And I met people who thought that it was just a crazy conspiracy theory of their, mom who'd gone a bit QAnon. Like that's what they
You
thought.
still believe that?
Very intelligent, very intelligent people who have affiliations to Harvard University is probably actually not that surprising for many people. But other people who were clued in and were actually quite encouraging in other regards, but everyone being very, very, very quiet and not willing to speak up, which is also part of the kind of where we are in these times. So I actually think for a lot of people in the kind of liberal space, they haven't got the memo. There's a lot of people who still think it's a conspiracy theory. And so there's a lot of work to be done.
Well, Andrew Lowenthal, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Great to have been here. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Andrew Lowenthal and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Yanya Kellick.
For President Joe Biden as he runs for re-election. Extra funding for border security has become a partisan issue in Congress as lawmakers debate over its inclusion in a package to provide additional aid to Israel and Ukraine in their wars against Hamas and Russia.
Now let's take a look at other national headlines.
Must apply for a license from the Bureau. McCall argues that the agency approves most of those requests. From January to March 2022, the BIS denied only 8% of license applications. The flow of U.S. tech is, quote, giving our military useful technologies. Examples include Chinese tech giant Huawei and SMIC, one of China's largest semiconductor makers. Both are tied to the Chinese military and are sanctioned by Washington. The report says from late 2020 to early 2021, BIS approved $60 billion worth of licenses for Huawei. The agency also approved $40 billion worth of license for SMIC. Besides approving license requests, McCall's report also found the U.S. has struggled to track what the technology was used for after it was exported. Between 2016 and 2021, the U.S. had 2 export control officers in China. They likely verified less than 0.01% of all licenses. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo has been asking for a larger budget for the BIS. In an interview with Foreign Policy, she said the agency's budget is similar to what it was a decade ago, yet it has to process twice as many licensing requests now. NTD reached out to the Commerce Department for comment but did not hear back before airtime. Are U.S. sanctions falling short? Reports say mysterious ghost fleets are helping countries like Iran and Russia dodge the rules, and that these elusive ships are used to sell oil around the world. But who else is reaping the benefits? NTD's Emma Shi has more.
Iran uses a ghost fleet of more than 300 foreign-owned and foreign-flagged oil tankers to ship hundreds of millions of barrels of Iranian oil, skirting U.S. energy sanctions.
At a House hearing Tuesday, experts told lawmakers that sanctions enforcement on Iran and Russia have weakened under the Biden administration. This permits these nations to use ghost fleets to sell energy worldwide.
Ghost fleets are often moribund, unsafe, non-environmental. There are accidents waiting to happen. And they're often not insured.
International trade expert Adam Smith says these ghost fleets are not on the radar. They switch off their location transponders, transfer goods from ship to ship, change their country of registration, and could have complex ownership structures, making it difficult to know who the owner is.
They're not actually ghosts. And so there's still a way for them to be attached to the non-ghost world, be it insurance, be it infrastructure or otherwise. And again, it's focusing on the intermediaries that are not ghosts, right? They're actually in the real economy.
A key player that's affected by weak sanctions enforcement.
China.
China is a very close partner to Iran and Russia. It's the largest purchaser of Iranian oil, which helps the terrorism funding state evade sanctions the most.
So the country that's benefiting most from this lax sanctions enforcement is China. China's able to purchase cheap oil, not just from Iran, but also from Venezuela and Russia as well. And its economy benefits from that. Well, other countries have higher oil prices.
Iran expert Claire Youngman believes the U.S. has done nothing to stop oil sales into China. She says we should sanction the Chinese banks that make this possible. Emma Shi, NTD News. For more from the Chinese economy. Kyle Bass is Chief Information Officer at the Heyman Capital Hedge Fund. He says China's once booming real estate sector is collapsing. Major developers like Evergrande and Country Garden are buried under debt. While a former Beijing official said China now has enough empty homes to house 3 billion people. Bass also touched on the country's local property market. It's financially backed by local governments under China's communist regime. That $13 trillion market is also grappling with heavy debt and defaults. Bass says, quote, "We don't even know where the bottom to that market is." For comparison, U.S. banks lost about $700 billion during the Great Financial Crisis in 2008. Defense ministers for Washington and Beijing have yet to talk. That's nearly a month after the head of the Chinese regime agreed with President Biden that the U.S. and China should restore military talks. We spoke to the host of China Insider, David Zhang, to find out what's behind the delay.
President Biden describes military-to-military communication with China as critically important. It's expected to take the form of a hotline between the country's defense departments. So what's behind the halt?
The CCP has always used these communication channels as a bargaining chip, and they won't follow through unless there's value to be gained. And we don't even have a new defense minister to be revealed in the Chinese regime. So this is clearly a process of tremendous instability inside the party right now.
China doesn't have a defense minister now. The highest position in Beijing's military has been empty for nearly 2 months. Former Defense Minister Li Shangfu was fired after he disappeared from public view with no official explanation. Washington seems more eager to relaunch talks than Beijing. An NBC Saturday article reported that according to 3 senior officials, U.S. defense officials have repeatedly tried to reach out to the Chinese side, but with no answer. What makes communication so urgent?
The CCP can act aggressively, and we've seen this in the recent events, the tension with the Philippines in the South China Sea. It allows them to be aggressive unchecked by the United States rule of law and these communications boundaries.
And if China can't keep its promises?
I think Biden can boost his credibility on China if it makes it clear that it is the CCP who's not following through with the communications.
Beijing cut off military communication with Washington when former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan last year. That's to protest Washington's support of Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party claims the island as its territory, although it's never ruled it. As of now, the American and Chinese militaries haven't communicated for 17 months.
Chinese citizens are flocking to buy up $2,400 per ounce, marking a historic high. China's struggling economy is being hit hard with deepening deflation. Last month, consumer prices saw their steepest drop since the pandemic. That's according to data from the National Bureau of Statistics, meaning Chinese consumers have reduced their spending amid economic uncertainty. The price plunge sparked calls for Beijing to act and boost demand. Chinese officials are expected to meet this month to talk about the economy and publish new plans for economic priorities. Chinese fast fashion brand Shein has managed to outpace Zara and H&M. Despite allegations over plagiarism and forced labor, the company's low prices continue to draw shoppers en masse. But how does Shein's production cycle work? A July lawsuit in California revealed Shein's use of AI and a special algorithm used to scrape the internet for design ideas. And another key part of the strategy, tapping a network of largely China-based suppliers. That's in light of accusations Shein uses Uyghur forced labor in the Xinjiang region to make its cheap apparel. Recent import records show virtually all of Shein's products imported to the U.S. came from China. A desperate plea for help from the UK. On Tuesday, the son of imprisoned Hong Kong pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai met with Britain's foreign secretary, urging the diplomat to help secure his father's release. The 76-year-old British citizen has been in detention since 2020, and he's facing a litany of charges, which could land him a lifetime prison sentence if he's convicted. NTD's Sam Wong has more.
Known for his fierce criticism of Beijing, Jimmy Lai was once the richest and most prominent activist in Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. But after spending years in prison, Lai's son Sebastian is leading an international campaign to save him.
He's a man who, as a child, as a 12-year-old, escaped from China to Hong Kong and fell in love with the freedoms of Hong Kong. He built a business empire, built a lovely, happy family. But he decided to sacrifice all these things that he had.
As the Chinese Communist Party began to tighten its grip on the city, Lai's tabloid Apple Daily became the leading source of support for Hong Kongers who were seeking freedom and democracy. But the once popular outlet was shuttered with force in 2020 after authorities raided its headquarters and arrested several top executives, including Lai himself.
By putting my father on trial for these things that are that used to be very much legal, journalism, pro-democracy protests, freedom of speech, they are essentially putting their own freedoms on trial.
Lai is facing charges under the draconian national security law Beijing imposed on the city. It's largely seen as a way to subdue the CCP's opponents outside its jurisdiction. The measure led to the arrest of more than 200 people, including several Hong Kong lawmakers and many prominent pro-democracy activists. Sebastian told AP News that his father likely won't get a fair trial, but he's hopeful that Britain will work to secure his release.
There's 3 government-appointed judges, and there's no jury. The security minister boasted of a 100% conviction rate. So this is not going to be a fair trial. But I know that with international pressure,